Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and we're on video number 4 of The Origin of Satan. I'm finding this very interesting myself. I hope you are too. Welcome to everybody. If you're new to being a member and new to being a subscriber, I hope you're enjoying this. I wish you would spread the word. There are not very many people interested in these books, which I find really disheartening and very sad because I am selective about it. I pick things that I think are interesting. I guess maybe I have very odd taste in books. I don't know. But I mean, Elaine Pagels, she's won all kinds of awards. She's a great writer. Oh, well, let's get on with this. We're on chapter 4 of The Origin of Satan. This chapter is Luke and John claim Israel's legacy. The split widens. Luke, as we said before, was the only Gentile gospel writer. He spoke for the converts who thought of themselves as heirs to Israel despite ethnicity. So this is the big debate. The covenant with God handed down to Abraham and to the people of Israel. You are God's chosen people. Is it just for the people who are ethnically part of that community? Or does it translate to the people who accept Jesus as the Messiah, the early Christians? Big theological debate going on here. And this is the origin of that animosity between God and Satan, good and evil, the Christians and everybody else. So unlike Matthew, who said that God had revoked his covenant with Israel, mainstream Judaism, and given it to the followers of Christ, Luke was much more easygoing. He believed, God gave salvation to everybody. Now, keep in mind, he's a Gentile. So he's coming from less of a self-identification, So this belief that God offers salvation to everybody, this is pretty much in mainstream Christianity today. How you get there is what's always disputed. But Luke was very clear that those who didn't accept Jesus as Messiah were allied with evil powers of darkness. So here we go. This is the real opposition of good and evil, God and the devil. Luke tweaks the prophecies and the story of Jesus's origin in order to prove that Jesus's conception was a miracle. And we know that Matthew played with that too. Luke sees no animosity between between Jesus and fellow Jews as an adult. The devil challenges Jesus, and when it didn't work, the devil was responsible for Judas and also responsible for the arrest and death of Jesus. So now the devil is being blamed, but they're equating people who don't believe with them as the devil. So they're blurring the boundaries between opposition, intimate enemies, people who are part of your community but don't agree with you, and evil. That's a dangerous boundary to lose. So through Jesus's life, the devil hung in the background in the Gospel of Luke, influencing opposition against Jesus, working through people. Excuse me. Luke has Jesus say that Jesus was rejected by the townspeople because God wanted them to reject him and therefore save the Gentiles instead. I don't know. This gets very complicated. Luke describes some of the Pharisees and the scribes against Jesus because they're influenced by Satan. Luke describes Jesus' followers as the only true Israelites left, whether they were born Israelites or not. They're the closest to God because they accept Jesus as the Messiah. This is spiritual warfare, is what they're setting up here. Luke constantly describes the Jewish and Roman opposition to Jesus as spiritual good being attacked by spiritual evil. Satan took advantage of the moment in Luke and entered Judas, and the rest is Bible history. I wrote that. Luke identified the Jewish leaders as Satan incarnate. He called the Jewish leaders the power of darkness. That's St. Luke said that, not my words. What really happens, it's been endlessly debated. Who knows? Uncertain who came up with Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Those were not contemporary terms. During the lifetime of Jesus, nobody would have used that word, Messiah, or called anybody the Son of God. Now, that's what Pagels said, and she's the expert. She knows all the languages and all the history and all the Bible. So I will defer to her. I wouldn't even know where else to begin to refute. They're not contemporary terms. They probably came later from within the Christian community as the stories were rewritten. But it seems likely that during his lifetime, somebody proclaimed him as king in the political sense. The Sanhedrin were very threatened by that claim. First of all, how can he be king of the Jews? That's not okay. And second of all, this is going to get the Romans on the red alert and the mob riled up. So you see the political, social upheaval that was stirring around this. And according to Luke, this is why the Jewish leaders handed him over to the Romans. Now, once again, I'll remind you, I have no idea what happened. I wasn't there. And historians don't really know what happened. They can speculate, but they don't know. So this is said by Pilate. You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, because Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. And Herod sent him back. I don't want him. I don't want anything to do with him. He sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him, by Jesus. I will therefore chastise him and release him. So the Jews encouraged, begged, I don't know what the proper word is, the Romans to arrest Jesus. He was brought before the Jewish big shots. They sent him to Pilate. Pilate sent him to Herod. Herod sent him back to Pilate. And then they asked the mob, if you remember Barabbas, that whole scene. Luke says that Pilate addressed the mob and demanded with loud cries, that Jesus should be crucified, and their voices prevailed, and Pilate ordered that their demand be granted, and he gave Jesus over to their will. So everybody is foisting blame and responsibility on everybody else, but they're all pragmatically involved in this. They have something to gain. And the mob, they're just whipped up emotionally because, political stuff. So Luke seems to blame the Jewish leaders for the whole thing and emphasize that Jesus is innocent of doing anything wrong. In Luke, Jesus forgives the robber, that was hanged next to him, even while he was dying. And, the way that more philosophical eyes reading this say that this is allegorical, and it's an indication of submission to the will of God and giving up of the material world and acceptance of eternal spiritual life. That's not how it's taken. Peter blames the Jewish leaders, and Luke helped form the idea that Pilate was like a weakling and the Jews were responsible, and many of Jesus's followers had no spine. Luke set up this whole narrative. Quote, those who reject Jesus accomplish Satan's work on earth. So there you go. Those who reject Jesus set up Satan's work on earth. A quote from St. Luke. This clearly equates the followers of Jesus with good and the opposers of him as Messiah as evil or Satan. The author of the Gospel of John, who was a Jewish convert, is equally bitter about the minority. He has Jesus say to the Jews, you are of your father, the devil. And they call him a Samaritan who is not a real Jew. So now we're throwing name calling and accusations and insults back and forth. And this just is a really good reflection of the bitter conflict that did exist then in about 100 CE AD. The leaders forcibly expelled Christians from synagogues. We know that. They denied the common worship. They were too schismatic, I guess you could say. And as a result, these tossed out Christians felt that they were hated by the world. And they felt rejected by the people and the culture into which they had been born. So there's a big debate. And is it true? We don't know that at this time, a prayer, which was really a curse, was a benediction. And so there was a specific ritual prayer called a benediction, and it wasn't putting a blessing on somebody, it was cursing, saying what the good was to show what the bad was. This was a way of distinguishing heretics. And supposedly in Luke, this prayer was said against the Nazarenes. We don't know. I have it written down here. Is this true or did it happen later? That's the question the book asks. And not everything can be known. Not everything is known. There's just no evidence. So John tells the story of Jesus as a story of a cosmic conflict, the light and the dark. Christians considered themselves an oppressed minority, as we said. Rejected by their own people, hated by the Romans. Yeah, they were not feeling good. So John begins his Gospels with God separating the light from the dark, but he refers to God as the Logos, the Word, and that's very Gnostic. The light of humankind shone through Jesus, he said, who was spiritual, the progenitor of the children of God. John says that Jesus, like God, separated the light from the dark against the sons of the devil. But John never actually personifies Satan. He doesn't describe Satan as a walking around whispering people's ears. He has Satan, this evil, dark, operating through people. So he tries to tempt Jesus through people. He's offered the opportunity to turn stones into bread. And his response, Jesus' response, was that man does not live by bread alone. It was very symbolic, by the way. A lot of this stuff was hugely symbolic for the people of the time, and we don't know what that symbolism is automatically. It's not inherent in our culture. I forget now what bread symbolized, but bread symbolized something like, I don't know, wisdom or knowledge or the passing on of I don't really remember, but Jesus identifies Judas and the Roman soldiers as supernatural enemies in human form in this gospel. He presents in the gospel, he presents the passion of Christ as a struggle, literally, between Jesus and Satan. Unbelief comes from being children of the devil. All of these things are now being spelled out suddenly in this last gospel. John and his followers are more removed from the Jewish majority. They're more removed from the time of Jesus. They were not contemporary with Jesus, and it's easier for them to demonize those who don't agree. John separates Jesus and his followers from the rest of the Jewish world, but it's not an ethnic distinction. It's about who embodies good and who embodies evil. And it's rejecting and unbelieving that distinguish the good from the bad. So this is a quote from a New Testament scholar. From a general non-acceptance of Jesus by people in the early chapters of John, the opposition becomes more and more identified with the specific group, the Jews. Ultimately, the group stands for the forces opposed to Jesus, which are the forces of darkness. Let me reiterate for the sake of YouTube, I am not espousing this. I'm reading from a quotation from biblical history. This is the debate we're talking. It's obvious that we're not dealing with an ethnic group, but with a dramatic theological symbol. We would miss the full significance of this symbol if we considered the Jew as a thing, like an entity in the Gospel of John, if we considered that as an historical figure. But that's not what's going on here. It's anybody who is a threat to the worship of God in their definition of spirit and truth as early Christians. So it's setting up this opposition in cosmic terms. Other scholars actually disagree with this. They identifying evil with one group has all sorts of religious, social, and political implications. And those all come into play, whether people want to admit it or not. John called the Jewish people in this role of opposition, and he called them to be in the role of opposition. And they could never agree on how they were actually going to define that group of opponents. Was it an ethnic group only? Was it unbelievers only? There was never consensus, and the debate burns on, it rages on. Certainly reflects some complicated political, religious, and social stuff, complicity in actual events in the death of Christ, but it also strongly reflects divisions in the Jewish community. They were really struggling to maintain cohesion. Actually, it's in the simplest terms, John associates mythological figures of Satan with specific human opponents. I have an example. Okay, so a group of the Israelites attempt to stone Jesus for speaking words that they consider blasphemy. And Jesus says, I must do the work of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one may work. As long as I am the Word, I am the light of the world. It's quite a claim. John's clear. Satan made them do it. And Jesus is the light. He's the good guy. According to the Gospel of John. In John, Jesus describes his death as God's judgment against this world, the world of the diabolical. Jesus basically says this is good versus evil. Anyone involved or not accepting Jesus is also of the devil. John makes a huge point of equating the perpetrators of the whole Jesus situation with the enemy Jewish community, he basically makes them complicit. He says that the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the Sanhedrin together and said, "What shall we do? This man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, the Romans will come and destroy our holy place and our nation." So you see how politics actually came into this, if what he's saying is true, and we just don't know. They were worried about stirring up the people. They were worried about, the mob and retaliation against them by Rome. So this is the debate. Could the high priests and the Sanhedrin execute somebody? Why would they hand him over? But they did execute others by stoning them in the middle of the first century. So it was certainly still going on when Jesus was alive. But they would have to get Roman permission. So is that what happened? We don't know. It's not. There's no definitive historical answer, but these are good things to know so that you can, hash it out with people. John makes it clear the Romans did it, but the Jewish leaders forced it. That's an interesting distinction. John paints a picture of a reluctant Pilate, indecisive, maybe a little afraid, up against the vindictive enemies of Jesus from his own larger community. The character of Pilate, interestingly, softens as time goes by. So in the earliest writings, Pilate was, a hard character. But as time went by from one gospel to the next, the stories are written farther removed from historical events. Pilate gets a little bit more squishy and uncertain. The intimate enemy becomes more the antagonist. It's like the roles are traded. The Gospels evolve the story of the rival groups by saying that the others are possessed by the devil. In John, Satan is incarnate in Judas, in the authorities, in the greater community that's not Christian. So this is the social history of Satan. As historical tensions between the Christians and other groups increased, the opposition becomes the devil. The enemy is evil incarnate. So now Satan is getting right down to politics as much as everything else. So chapter 5, Satan's earthly kingdom, Christians versus the pagans. By about the year 100 in the Gospel of John, Christianity was largely Gentile. New converts found their lives threatened by the pagans because the pagans said, well, these Christians, they won't worship the gods. What's wrong with them? They're atheists. The Romans were interesting. They marched all over the world. Well, Mediterranean world anyway. And they, depending on politically what was going on, they did revenge, but most of the time they would conquer a people and then they would establish a Roman bureaucracy, and then they would let them they would tolerate their cultural beliefs, believe whatever you want to believe, worship, whoever, we don't care, except for one thing. You have to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor, and you have to publicly engage in that. And some went along with it because it was just, who cares if you don't really believe it? If it keeps the peace, okay. And others were just zealots to their own belief and refused to acquiesce. But the Jewish community, they distinguish themselves by keeping separate, but they tried to ameliorate the problem and to go along. But then you got the Christians from that community, and they were like, no way. We're not worshiping false gods. We're not engaging in any of the rituals of the Roman pagan belief system. And in the eyes of the Romans, that made them atheists. They won't worship the gods. They don't believe in the gods. What's wrong with them? And this came from fear. The Romans did believe in them, were sincerely frightened of the wrath of their gods, and they thought that that was going to come down on the Romans' heads because this was Roman territory and some of the people were not worshiping the gods. So now the enemy is no longer members of the Jewish community. Now the enemy becomes the Roman Gentiles. There always has to be an enemy. The Gospels written before this were more favorable towards the Gentiles, embraced Gentiles joining the Christian church, and everything was, they were more inclined to be mad at their fellow Jewish community. So while Christianity was a very small minority movement within the Jewish community, the Christians saw the other Jews as potential enemies and the Gentiles as potential converts. But Paul and Luke talked about threats from fellow Jews and the Romans as the protectors of the early Christians against the threats of the fellow Jews. Paul actually was executed later by the Romans. 10 years later, Nero blamed the Christians for the big fire in Rome that burnt down about 75% of the city of Rome. Actually, Nero was delighted. He had construction plans in his honor. So this is kind of triggering, if that's the right word. He arrested a whole bunch of Christians, and to retaliate for the fire, he burned them alive as torches. But the Christians equated this with evil. They're saying this is not a political thing. This is evil. They didn't feel like they were fighting, a government, a political group. They felt they were fighting evil. Our contest is not against flesh and blood human beings, but against powers, against principalities. Those are kinds of angels, actually, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. And that comes from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It's spiritual warfare. In Revelation, the author equates Rome with Satan and the devil. They saw demonic forces working through the Roman officials. The Gentile converts saw the pagans were being driven by Satan to menace God's chosen people. The pagans were against the Christians, especially because the Christians severed the bond between religion and a nation or a people. So it was very unusual to be a religious belief system, but not to identify with any one particular nation. Rather, they're scattered all over the place, and yet they shared this religious belief. And I wrote in the margins how times change. Christian membership transcended ethnicity, nationality. This was an identification with a belief system. It broke all former bonds of kinship and affiliation. Paul wrote, "In Christ there is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. For those born again in baptism, the world consists of only two kinds of people: those who belong to God's kingdom, whose citizenship is in heaven, and those still ruled by the evil one, subjects of Satan." Well, I don't think they could be any more clear in identifying religious opposition as the devil. The sect, the Christianity grew, and the question is, why did it grow? So Justin, not your daughter's boyfriend, Justin was one of the early fathers of the church. He wrote about seeing Christians in the Colosseum. Like, he was not a Christian, and he went to the Colosseum and he saw them being eaten up by the animals, and he said, "Oh my God, look at these illiterate people accepting death with equanimity, the kind of equanimity advocated by Plato, or Zeno. Zeno was an early Stoic. Why are they so okay with being killed? He felt that they had tapped into some unknown power. It intrigued him. So these Christians, they saw themselves as combatants in a cosmic struggle, warriors against Satan. They felt that their deaths hastened God's victory over evil, over the Romans and the spectators. So then Justin met an old Christian who told him that he worried that he would never, the old Christian worried that Justin would never find illumination in philosophy because he was seeking self-realization in the wrong place. There's that book, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And it's an argument that, maybe you can find illumination other than what this old guy says. So he'd been a Stoic, and he'd learned to put life's events in a kind of universal perspective and to participate in nature and the divine and sort of take a step back from all the chaos going on around him. And at that point, he was following the teachings of Plato. But the old Christian asked Justin, is there a great power in our mind? Can a human mind see God by its own abilities? The Christian told Justin that you're wasting your time. The human mind cannot ever understand God. Justin was led by this Christian man to believe that the mind is infested by demonic powers that confuse it. And the old guy said, you need to be exorcised from those demons, drive out those demons out from your mind. So Justin eventually believed that Christians had access to divine power through their rituals, and it started with baptism. So this old guy told him, there's no name for him, I'm not being derogatory, it's just the old guy. Pray that above all things the gates of light may be open to you, for these things cannot be perceived or understood by everyone, but only by the person to whom God and his Christ have given wisdom. And it's really important to remember that Christ is not a person. Christ is he who is anointed or enlightened. And that was his advice. So Justin pursued baptism and got the demons expelled, and then did this ritual washing in water, which is it's a Gnostic ritual that's symbolic of the death of the old self, that you're kind of washing away the physical material world and you're being reborn. And they even during the baptismal ceremony, they actually, they immerse them in water. They put white clothes on them to represent the purity of their spirit. And then they give them baby food, milk and honey. The land of milk and honey. It was all about symbolism. It was all about rebirth of the soul that is turning its back on the material world and heading towards the source, the spark of God. So he then rejected his religious and familial past, Justin did, and he saw the universe as the battleground of cosmic forces. He now saw former gods and practices were demonic, his pagan beliefs, and not to be revered, as the forces of nature were beyond human comprehension. Pagan religions tended to be more closely tied to the natural world. Stoicism certainly was. But now he's equating them, as the Christians do, with Satan. So the Greeks had a word for spirit energies, neither good nor bad. They just were spirit energies, daimones, and it's where the word demon comes from. And we equate the word demon with devil or evil. But originally, that's not what it was. It was just spirit entities. Some were good, some were bad, some were helpful, some were tricksters. So Justin extols the changes in reborn people. He reflected on the moral relativism of many philosophies. well, we can't know, so he sees that his choices determined his exterior destiny, and he made him a combatant in the universal struggle between God and Satan. Whereas many Stoics, many pagans believed that fate was in charge of everything. Now, Justin is isolated from his family, from his community, and he's politically insecure. He's liable to be arrested because he's identified as a Christian and be tortured and put to death. And he ascribes all of it to Satan. Our contest is not against flesh and blood, but against powers, against principalities, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. She uses that same quote. She used it earlier. It's why I kind of hesitated. Like, didn't I already read this? I did already read it. Socrates felt the same way about the pagan gods. He denounced religion. He was charged with atheism, and that's why he died. He was forced to do it to himself. The demons were to blame for the irrational hatred of the Christians. Justin wrote to the emperor and to the emperor's sons, and one of his sons was Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher. And he said, well, as fellow philosophers, let's talk about this on a philosophical level. And he told these guys, these are the big shots, the emperors. Even now, he said, these demons seek to keep you as their slaves by preventing you from understanding what we, the Christians, say. Their irrational public hatred of Christians proves, Justin says, that their minds have been captured by the same evil spirits who incited the Athenians to kill Socrates. Now, for the same reason, these spirits are driving them all to kill Christians. Whether you agree with him or not, it took guts to write something like that to the emperor. Marcus Aurelius was the great Stoic philosopher, and he wrote Meditations. I've talked about it before. If you go back, you'll find I did some videos on him, and his very interesting struggles, meant to be private, but then made public, of him trying to figure this all out. He also wrote to the Senate, and that was a bridge too far. He got arrested. Let those who refuse to sacrifice to the gods and obey the commands of the emperors be beaten and led away to suffer the punishment of beheading in accordance to the laws. That was his sentence. He believed that in his death, he had triumphed over the demons who use the fear of pain and death as weapons. People think Stoics are unemotional. What they're really trying to do is to transcend the imbalance, the intemperance of human emotion. Try to detach, as the Buddhists do, from the physical world. Sickness, death, controversy, pain, suffering. They just accept, life inevitably is full of suffering. And it's not one of those you can fight them or join them. It's more you can accept it and rise above it. There's no point, because inevitably we all end up in the same place. Justin's view was the opposite of Marcus Aurelius's truth. Marcus Aurelius believed that he and everyone were subject to forces that rule the universe, the fates, kind of. And they're embodied in the gods, these forces. He believed them all to be a part of a larger cosmic order, the natural world, universal law, and that you might as well submit to nature. It's a necessity, and submit to destiny with equanimity. Just is the reality of life. And that's why they were always tempering their emotions. Death is like birth. It's a mystery of nature. It's an inevitability. That's how they looked at it. The human soul is most arrogant when it becomes, as far as it can, a kind of abscess or a tumor on the universe. For to complain at anything that happens is a rebellion against nature. So he didn't believe that life was meaningless. Good and evil happen randomly to everybody, to anybody. No such thing. Oh, how could that happen? You're such a good person. What matters in the eyes of the Stoics was how do you respond to what happens. You can't control the vagaries of life, but you can and should control your reaction to it. Practicing equilibrium was their big thing. And then they believe in the unity of all being, because it's all part of the one natural world. All things are woven into one another, and the bond that unites them is sacred, and hardly anything is alien to any other, for they are ordered in relation to one another, and they join together to order the same universe. For there is one universe consisting of all things, and one essence, and one law, and one divine reason, and one truth, and also one fulfillment of the living creatures that have the same origin and share the same nature. So he looks at destiny and nature as kind of part and parcel of each other. And our job is to detach from an emotional reaction to it, accept it, and try to react with as much integrity as we can. Strive to accept your lot. It's a belief in the universal power of fate. So this was not a prevalent belief. People were always hoping for the intercession of the gods. I mean, they were sacrificing and lighting incense and praying and beseeching and consulting priests and priestesses. Only the Jews and the Christians were monotheists at the time. I don't know if that's 100% accurate. I don't know enough about small little belief systems. I know that Islam, I think, came around the 700s, I think. So maybe that's true. They looked at everybody else as demons. The Christians were the only ones who were dividing the entire earth into good and evil. And by doing so, they set themselves up in opposition to the government all the time. Justin's student, I'm going to say this wrong, Tatian, had this to say. Page 131. I think it's Tatian. Talks about his spiritual independence. If I do not wish to comply with some of your customs, why am I hated as if I were despicable? Now he's talking about the Roman government and the law. Does the governor order me to pay taxes? I do so willingly. Does he order me to do service? I acknowledge my servitude. For one must honor human beings in a way appropriate to humans, but one must fear God alone. For he who is not visible to human eyes, nor perceptible by any means known to us. So he goes on to describe the demonic forces against God trying to enslave humanity. He points out that philosophers are not immune from this cosmic war. For example, Aristotle, he was a man, right? But as Tatian and Justin argue, he was nothing more than a rational animal. Tatian says that man is much more, after they become Christian. This is the pagan belief, rational animal. The Christian belief is, well, yeah, but you're made in the image of God, and that makes you special. They reject man as just a part of nature. There's more to it. And it says that they stand above with God because man is essential and essential to God, part of God, and also has an indestructible spirit. He separates physical travails and fate from spiritual eternity. Stoics do too, though, in a way. It depends on how you look at it. Let's see. He says, the demands of culture, the demands of society. I do not want to be a ruler. I am not anxious to be rich. I decline military command. I detest sexual promiscuity. I am not impelled by any insatiable love of money to go to sea. I do not contend for reputation. I am free from an insane thirst for fame. I despise death. I am superior to every form of disease. Grief does not consume my soul. If I am a slave, I endure slavery. If I'm free, I do not boast of my fortunate birth. Why are you destined so often to grasp for things and often to die? Die to the world, repudiating the insanity that pervades it. Live to God, and by apprehending God, meaning understanding, apprehending your own nature as a spiritual being created in God's image. Why say something with 2 words when you can say it with 200, right? So Tatian said that I reject your entire system of government. That's what that was. We don't know what happened to him as a result of all these public statements. Then we come to Origen, and it's Origen. It's a name of a guy. It's not this word, which is like, where does something get originally come from? His name is Origen. He saw his father executed because he was a Christian. He resolved at the age of 17 to be a God warrior against Satan. And his words are, he was wary of power. He said that people have the moral right to do away with tyrants. Not my words, his words from the early Christian church, because he saw his father executed. The execution of his father impoverished his family. Their property was confiscated. He always saw the imperial forces as demons. He was fostered by a rich Christian lady who became a teacher. He became a teacher to support his family. They lived under suspicion. He probably escaped execution only because his mother was Egyptian. And he inherited, by his birth to an Egyptian, he inherited status low enough to not be bothered with. They didn't bother to execute him. The new emperor had new attitudes, and he invited Origen to the palace to meet the emperor. And eventually, the new emperor, Heliogabalus, there's a name. He was a sun worshiper and a fanatic and insane. This is that the original new emperor had invited Origen to come to the palace. And then there was a different new emperor, and he was nuts. He was replaced by his cousin Severus, who favored the Christians. So they didn't like Christians. The emperor did. Had Origen as a guest. Then Heliogabalus was busy being nuts and worshiping the sun, hated Christians. Then Severus came, and he was good. He favored the Christians. But then hope was shattered when Severus was killed, and his replacement began the persecutions again. So it kind of makes your head spin. He wrote to arrested friends, exhorting them to martyrdom. For those arrested for Christ, capitulation to Satan was the renouncing of faith. So don't renounce your faith. Not because death brings victory. That's not what he was talking about. But you just can't renounce your faith. And I wrote in parentheses here, death cult. Eventually, a Christian emperor showed up, Philip the Arabian. You got to love that name, Philip the Arabian. And during his time, there were thousands of converts to Christianity. Origen complained because now it was not so dangerous to be a Christian anymore. He was kind of bummed. I'm serious. That's what he said. Well, he didn't say bummed, but he complained that Christianity was no longer worth risking your neck for because you didn't risk your neck. But the next emperor made up for it. Origen was arrested and tortured, and he knew that the Romans saw Christianity as an anti-Roman uh, government group, and they were defying the rule of law, refusing to sacrifice to the gods, and challenging and destroying, to a certain point, legitimate authority, and wanting to bring down the empire. That's how they regarded them. Origen wrote a challenge to the moral legitimacy of imperial rule, just to make sure that it was dangerous to be a Christian. All the laws the people were hostile to, Christians called demon inspired. Sounds familiar. They pointed out Jesus's humble origins, but look at how the religion spread to shake the whole civilized world. He pointed to the world events that he said proved are because Jesus was divine. So, for example, he said, look at how Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. It's because they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. He didn't blame all the misfortune in the world as God's will. He said sometimes there were accidental byproducts of just life, but often it was because they were demons. They weren't Christian. Some contemporaries of his pointed out the contradictions to monotheism that were created by setting up a system that was dualistic, the Satan and the God. They said that's not monotheistic. You've got a good God and an evil God. The opposition to Christians came with Tacitus again. The first thing they do when they get hold of people is to teach them to despise their gods, neglect their cities, and hate their families. Everything that we know as piety, they neglect. Now, that's a Roman senator looking at the Christians and thinking, what is their problem? The Christians said that the old bonds that they were rejecting would enslave them to demons. They had to reject them. The pagans saw this whole God-Satan dualism as a heresy. What are you talking about? There's only one God, and then you're afraid of this evil one. Within so-called monotheism, you have two equal entities. To them, that was multiple gods. Some writers said this is all a human invention, that it's creating rebellion in the kingdom of God. It's inventing a conflict. Refusing to worship the gods is more of a statement of rebellion than a religious statement. The pagans saw all aspects of nature containing daimones, not demons, spiritual entities. And therefore, it's impossible to avoid in a material world of nature. I mean, you're in the physical world and there's entities in everything, and it can't be avoided. And it's pointed out to the Christians that they better watch out that by rejecting the natural world and the daimones, they are inadvertently incurring their wrath. And Origen conceded that this might make one feel that evil had won. But Origen said, this is the good news. Dead Christians free souls from the demons. So dead Christians, his words, not mine. It's good because then at least their souls are freed from the demons. The daimones know that Christians win by dying. So this willingness to die was called insanity by everybody else, but was feared that it might ruin the empire and plunge the world into anarchy. Origen claimed that the prayers of Christians were helping the emperor, whether he liked it or not. The reality was most Christians were not seditious. They were just want to keep their heads down and avoid conflict with the government. They really weren't rebels. They weren't seditious. They were just ordinary folks that had these religious beliefs. The big issue was the public confession of primary allegiance to God. Remember I said earlier that the Romans just wanted people to admit the emperor was the head god. That was what it was all about. and they wouldn't do it. So they had divided loyalties, divided political loyalties in the eyes of the Roman Empire. Origen said it was their right and obligation to disobey the evil laws of the government because they were being tyrannized by the devil. They considered themselves citizens of heaven, uh, allies of God against evil, and the emperor and the pagan mobs were the evil and the agents of Satan. And one cannot help but draw parallels to present day. I mean, where have we recently heard this before? So this is the end of video 4, and I will be back with more soon. I hope you like this. I find it very interesting that things, when we were young, I'll speak for myself. When I was young, I was taught not all of this stuff because, Catholicism is evolved a bit from and complicated from this original early Christian belief system. But it's so interesting to see how these so closely held religious beliefs are actually constructs of human conflict. I just find that fascinating. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. And we'll be back again with the next battle of good versus evil. Slán go fóill. Slán.